We'd like to share with you a little bit about the Indiana Barn Foundation, and really the reason for this particular video is because we had to cancel our barn tour as we did our annual meeting this year and didn't have an opportunity for people to get together. So this seemed to be the next best thing, to try to share with you a little bit about the history and heritage and the importance of some of these Indiana barns, and we have an opportunity to do it in video.
We bought this farm in 2015, got married in 2016 on site. Jeff farms. He's got about 60 acres of row crop ground and then pasture ground for about 40 head of cattle here. And then we built the wedding venue that you see behind us. In 2016, we actually moved it from a site and moved it here. There's obviously a historical aspect here. This barn was built in 1822. There's a cabin as well on site. And really our thought when we bought this farm, after we learned about the value of these structures, was we wanted to use the commercial income from the wedding venue to support the structures here on site, because with our day jobs, we didn't have the funding to keep everything up to the manner we wanted to. It was originally 124 acres. We got linked up with the Indiana Barn Foundation and some historians, and learned first about the history of this barn. So my understanding of this barn is that it was built around 1822. I've heard, obviously, they're hand-hewn beams. I've heard that the beams are tulip poplar and chestnut species. And from my understanding, one crib was likely put here first, with another one brought a little bit later. And what's interesting about this barn is as you expand out a little bit more, it's more of a timber frame type structure. So it just kind of shows the evolution of how construction was done. Additionally, the house on site is also made of these same hand-hewn beams with clapboard siding on top of it. It's a hall and parlor style home, and there's quite a few outbuildings on site as well. So we're actually in the process of going on the National Register of Historic Places as a historical district.
This is a really unique, one-of-a-kind space. This is what's known as a double crib barn. It's unique in several ways. It's a predecessor to later barns that occur in Indiana and all across the Midwest. And it's also important because of its structural components. It's a log barn. It's handmade, hewn by broad axe. And it's called a double crib barn. You need to understand that a crib, in barn parlance, if you will, is a room. So you might have a barn with several stalls for animals, and each would be referred to as a crib. So in the earliest days, you would have a single crib barn. The earliest, say, pioneer farmer would only be able to put up, whatever he had the materials for locally on his farm. And they would hew a crib, and those cribs could be used, they could be sealed up and used for grain, or they could be used for hay, which was very typical. They mainly were very primitive shelter for crops and goods, but also for animals. And so so what would happen typically was, as the farm expanded and the farmer became more affluent, they would add cribs. So they would build one, and then adjacent to it, as in this case, they would build another one just like it. If that process continued, they would build a third and a fourth, maybe a fifth and a sixth. And when they did that, they created these cross aisles between the buildings, and they left the buildings open so they could access them from all sides. Well, eventually they started to put roofs over the entire structure. And in this case, this is very interesting because it's the transition of the crib evolving into a greater crib barn, but also evolving into the barn that you might be able to see behind me, which is a transverse crib barn from 1892. This barn dates to 1822. So in 70 years, this rather primitive, early, and now very rare form transformed into what we see all across the Midwest, and as a matter of fact, all the way to the West Coast, the transverse frame barn. And what that refers to in its successor is an aisleway or driveway that goes all the way through the barn from one end to the other. So as the early farmer added cribs, he inadvertently created this aisleway, and slowly they closed off the cross aisles. So, and then he put a roof over the whole thing, and voila, he had this transverse crib barn. So it's almost accidental, but it's a beautiful thing to be able to witness on one site. And of course, this barn behind me was moved here at a later date, but nevertheless, it's fun to have them both side by side.
So we're Erica and Jeff Morris, and we are the owners of the Stipp Farm in Bloomington, Indiana. We purchased this property 3.5 years ago, and this farm was started in 1876 by the Stipp family and later sold to the Bender family. This farm, what's left of it, has a historic stone wall that's dry stacked and 6 outbuildings, including the dairy barn behind us, which was built in about 1810, a corn crib, and several other outbuildings, including a forge shed, as we call it, and a hog rendering barn, along with a carriage house. And so when the farm started, it was about 140 acres, but all that remains today is just under 6 acres.
This is a really good example of a preserved farmstead, meaning that we have not only the original house, which dates to the late 19th century, but also the accompanying farm buildings, so we can tell how the farm functioned and what the primary concerns were here. There's a carriage house that dates to 1875, which has been converted to a garage, so you wouldn't recognize it unless you go inside. And then there are several other barns. The one to my left is an older, earlier form, kind of general purpose barn. And then there's a main barn which was used for dairy, which you see behind me, and then some other work sheds. There's a absolutely phenomenal crib, wheat, grain, and corn crib. One of the best I've ever seen, I think. It's absolutely beautiful. And then there's a hog rendering building where hogs not only were fed but also were slaughtered, and where the meat was smoked. So the functions of a 19th century farm are all on display here, and most of the buildings are in good enough condition to really be able to read their original intention, and they've been changed somewhat over time. The house has been added onto and so on and modernized, but you really get the feeling of the farmstead when you enter the main gate, I guess. And this was at one time, I don't remember exactly, but it was several hundred acres. And it's also surrounded by these, what we call Irish stone walls, but with these slat stone walls, which are unique to Monroe County in many different areas, but there are some really excellent examples of that construction, and they're historic in their own right. The corn crib it's not a particularly unique design, but it's an absolutely pristine condition. So, and it's sitting on hand-cut pieces of limestone. You can even see the drill marks where they were cut out of the stone floors in Monroe County. So they tell a story about local stone resources in Monroe County, and also the fact that they're hand-carved and fitted in the way that they are. They keep the building high off the ground, the purpose of which was to keep out rats and vermin. One side is for grain, it's tightly sealed, and the other side is for corn, which is open slatted. So it's just a really lovely example of that architecture. And the barn behind me, which is built in, I believe, 1910, is a multi-purpose barn, which is the case for 20th century barns. They built it primarily for dairy and milking, feeding cows, not a big herd, but probably 20 maybe. And then the upper part of the upper 2/3 of it is hayloft under a gambrel roof, all signs of multi-purpose farming that has narrowed down to kind of specialty uses. And so it's typical of what was being built in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's been somewhat modernized and changed over time. It has some unique features. It has a well inside the barn, so they could water all their animals from just a pump. And it's really organized around dairy, but had obviously had multi-uses. They probably kept their horses in there and workhorses and so on. And there are various machine sheds that have been added, a blacksmith shop, things like that, that as the farm became more diverse, became more useful to homestead farming, basically. We've been living here on the Borland Farm since 1986. The house is built in the 1830s by the Borland family, who were very early settlers in the Bloomington area. The younger brother was what we would now call a master builder or architect, who was responsible for doing the masonry on the first courthouse, some of the early IU seminary buildings. And the older brother was the seminary agent to sell Perry Township to build Indiana University. So they were what we call frock coat pioneers, if you want. Today they would be called developers, and they would be doctors and lawyers instead of surveyors and masons. They lived here, their family was here until about 1930, and then they sold to a quarry company, mining company, that quarried quite a bit of the property. The barn is original to the Borland first generation. It was built in 1855, right before the Civil War, and the original Borland, one of them died right after that, and the other one lived almost to 1900. So they had a long tenure at this property. We've obviously been spending that, well, maybe it's not obvious, we've been spending the last 36 years restoring the house, and then more recently, since 2010, have restored the barn.
The restoration of the house came first because we had to have a plumbing and electricity and but the barn, actually, we decided to renovate. It was in pretty bad shape while Duncan was teaching at Ball State between like 2007 and 2012. And in the middle of that period, we decided to restore the barn. We would come down here weekends. We had a contractor and try to manage from afar the restoration. And it was challenging, but really exciting. In fact, we would come down here and spend weekends living in the barn. And that was really a great way to become intimate with the space in a way that you wouldn't if you were just on the outside of it. So living in it on the weekends and spending time in it really gave us a sense of the space and how we wanted to restore it.
One bay of this barn was so bad, in such bad condition, that we knew the frame couldn't be saved, but we knew we could save the rest of it. So we tried to figure out, we looked at the original construction, which is a so-called 3-bay barn, English threshing barn, and the one bay, one of the three, was in really bad shape. So with the contractor, we decided that we would just take that off, which basically just chainsaw it off, pull it away, and then rebuild it. And he said, if you want to be able to use this and make it most versatile, why don't we pour a concrete pad here instead of just putting in piers, and we'll build a structure that looks just like a barn on the outside, but it will give you an enclosed room, and you can insulate it, you can heat it, you can cool it. If you don't want to, fine, but you'll have that possibility. Well, at that time, I've always had a wood shop and have worked with my hands. Kathy was at Ball State with me, and she was taking a lot of classes in pottery and stuff, so she was really interested in doing ceramics. So we looked at this and thought, okay, here's a place where we can have a heated and cooled workshop. We could use it year-round. We were on the brink of retiring at that point, and so we actually developed the barn according to its original plan, but we utilized spaces in it according to the things that we needed.
I live here with my wife Linda, and we've been here 42 years. We had always been looking for an old house and finally found our dream house, and it's been our project ever since. And one of the projects that we've put off for 40 years was the barn. So this is our last big deal. We moved it. We wanted to get it farther away from the railroad tracks, for one thing. And the floor, the dirt floor, was riddled with groundhog tunnels. You kind of had to be careful where you walked because these tunnels are pretty deep. And I was kind of worried they'd get under the piers until I learned that the piers are fairly deep themselves. That's another reason we wanted to move it in. We wanted to do it on a good foundation, so we put a slab in with radiant heating, and Wolf moving from Fort Wayne came down and moved the barn onto the slab. And since then, we've worked with a wonderful contractor and a timber frame guy that works with them to gradually put things back together.
This is the skeleton, I guess you'll say, of a roughly 1900, late 1890s transverse frame barn. It was on this farm site from the time it was built. There's also a historic house here and several other historic buildings associated with the site that, as we've talked about earlier, are associated with the way the property was used and practices of farming and so on. This is a relatively small 3-bay hay barn, had a full loft in it, stabling for animals, limited use animals. Pretty typical southern Indiana scale for small farm buildings. And it has now been moved 25 or 30 feet from its original location. So this is an example of a historic barn building that's being entirely repurposed for a bed and breakfast and a more enclosed residential heated and cooled space, which is always very challenging in a timber frame structure because you have insulation, you have plumbing, you have heating and cooling, windows and doors, and all the conveniences of a house. And it's tricky to design it into a barn and maintain the essence of the barn while you do it. So this will display the entire sawn frame, original frame on the inside, or maybe 90% of it. So you will see that as you experience being in here once it's finished. So you'll definitely know it's a barn, and the owners have gotten this property designated historic locally in order to help them with some regulatory issues and so on, but have been really earnest about keeping the character of the barn itself.
Thank you for your donation to the Indiana Barn Foundation. It's donors like you who help to preserve Indiana's history, particularly our agricultural and rural history, one barn at a time.
Preserving historical Indiana barns, one barn at a time.
Preserving historical Indiana barns, one barn at a time.